Evening, everyone. It's great to welcome you all this evening to this special event, Disability Perspectives at Work, Challenges and Opportunities for Workplace Equity and Inclusion. This event is sponsored by Disability Studies programs here at the School of Professional Studies at the City University of New York, along with SPS Events. And I want to thank especially tonight Molly Joyce and Heather Zeman with the events team for helping us to put together the event. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank tonight's interpreters and note takers. And of course, we're all very excited to have 4 outstanding panelists with us tonight to discuss this question of disability in the workplace from a disability perspective, and from the perspective of people with disabilities, including employers with disabilities and employees with disabilities. A cornerstone of disability studies is listening to the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people with disabilities themselves. And part of what we want to accomplish tonight is thinking about how knowledge of living with a disability, working with a disability, can help us make more inclusive workplaces. So I want to just briefly introduce tonight's group of panelists, and then I will be glad to have my colleague, Dr. Brian Lillay, moderate a discussion with those panelists. At the conclusion of the discussion, we will have an opportunity to answer questions that you might have for the panelists. And we want to encourage you to use the Q&A option in the Zoom in order to ask those questions, and we will get to them at the conclusion of the discussion. You may note that we do have accessibility features for tonight's event, including live captions and ASL. And again, thank you to the note takers and interpreters who are helping us to provide that for all participants and registrants tonight. Our panelists include Reem Jafar, Director of Research, Evaluation, and Program Support at COPI, the Queen's STEM Academy, who is also a student in our MS program in Disability Services and Higher Education. Janine McAdam, founder and publisher of highsites.com, who's a student as well in the Advanced Certificate Program in Disability Studies. Kartik Sahani, Senior Manager, Technology and Products for Our Ability, Inc., and Sharnessa Warren, Director of Student Disability Services and Assistive Technology Specialist at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you all so much for being here. Brian, I'd like to turn it over to you now to begin our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Markham. And thank you to our 4 panelists, Reem, Janine, Kartik, and Sharnessa, for being with us. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I will present questions to guide the panelists in a loosely structured discussion. For the most part, I won't be leading the discussion. I will step back and encourage the panelists to talk with each other. So to the panelists, let's begin, if we could, let's begin our discussion at the end. Let's imagine the kind of world we want to bring about, one where the relationship between disabled individuals and the workplace could be considered equitable and inclusive. So the first question is, in your ideal future, what is the relationship between disabled people and the workplace? What should we be working toward? If you could, please give specifics. Reem, if you could, please get us started. After Reem shares her thoughts, Janine, Kartik, and Sharnessa, please feel free to jump in and answer as well.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking time of your evening to join us. And thank you, Professor Lillay and Andrew, for the introduction. My own vision of the ideal future, and I always dream of a good future, is the relationship between disabled individual and the workplace is characterized by inclusion. And I'll tell you, I'm going to be specific what I mean by inclusion, because we hear that term very often in the context of DEI. I mean that accepting disability as part of one's identity and normalizing its disclosure, much like we are normalizing now disclosing other aspects of our identity. This shift should move beyond mere legal compliance and aim to genuinely foster an inclusive environment. This is what Neera Jain refers to as a transformative approach with intentional inclusion, one where disability is a normal human variation, a valued social identity. And to be more specific, I want to point to some of the current reality that underscores why we need such a vision. And really, my idea for the future is to change those numbers. For example, many folks don't realize that actually disability is more prevalent than perceived. If you're a 20-year-old, there's 1 in 4 chance that you probably will become disabled before you retire at the age of 65. As of 2022, going back to the topic of long COVID have added an estimated, as of 2022, between 20 and 25 million people who would qualify for disability status. Additionally, individuals with disability face a 50% higher risk of poverty compared to their able-bodied counterparts. And as someone who works in STEM, I know that reality way too well. Only 7% of individuals with disability under 40 are actually employed in a STEM profession. Also, 10% we also need to keep in mind that when we talk about the workplace, the statistics shows that 10% of disabled individuals choose to disclose their disability to their employers. And most of the workplace accommodations, typically like flexible timing, actually comes from folks who do not have a disability. And so the narrative and the policies surrounding disability needs a complete paradigm shift for that ideal future. We often think about it in a paradigm of an individual challenge, a struggle, issue. We basically put the burden on the individual, but really it should be approached as an organizational responsibility. And to give you an example that is very relevant to CUNY and more recently with COVID, I would like to draw an example for Darla Shum's article, It's Time for Crib Time. And for those of you who have heard this term or those who have not heard, the concept of crib time in academia serves as an example. Shum is a blind academic, and in her writing, she emphasized the unique challenges faced by disabled individuals in academia in particular, and this is where my field is. The idea of crib time acknowledges the different way in which disabled individuals experience and manage time. And so in her opinion, this could translate, not in her opinion, but in her experience, it could translate to needing more rest when she reads paper, additional time to complete tasks, and extended duration for some academic pursuit, including publishing scholarly article. So she faced a lot of hurdles to do the research in the same time frame that other non-disabled scholars do. And this basically, for me, this highlights challenges. And she wanted to advocate for a broader acceptance, and we should advocate for a broader acceptance of a crib time to suggest that practices and policies, they don't not benefit disabled scholar or the disabled employee, but everyone. In fact, institution like CUNY has provided, I call, flexibility during the COVID-19 pandemic for its faculty. In fact, the faculty who were due for tenure by September 1st, 2021, had the option of a 1-year extension in their tenure review. Of course, this was a response to pushes due to equity issues that were impacting faculty who were parents specifically. Yet, we rarely draw ideas from disability scholars, such as the one Darla Shum present, to design a workplace with policies that actually champion support for individuals with disabilities, but really what it does is ultimately it benefits everyone. And as in a sense, disability inclusive practices are actually universally beneficial. They invite for innovation, they work for parents, they work for teams who have different way of learning things. So when you present information in different format and different modalities of engagement, it really does benefit everyone. And it really caters to everyone's unique strength and capability. So where would I want to see my ideal future? I'd love to see it moving all these numbers towards something where everyone feel inclusive, and the disability community, just like everyone who's able-bodied, can normalize disclosing their disability and moving all of these percentages I've shared with you earlier. Thank you, and I'm curious to hear from my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you, Reem. So to our other panelists, what do we think about this? What is the ideal future that you imagine, the ideal relationship between disabled people and the workplace?
Maybe I can take a shot. And I think I'm gonna talk a little bit from my lens of a technologist because, you know, as we just heard, when you think about what you know, what people with different perspectives are able to bring along, when they have different experiences, that actually is very valuable. When you think about a lot of the technologies that we have right now, you know, when you think about speech recognition, when you think about text-to-speech, when you think about personalization in general, you realize that a lot of these technologies were originally designed for people with disabilities, oftentimes as assistive technologies. And so when I think about an ideal world, and sort of the relationship between people with disability and workplaces, I really think about disability not something that you know, people kind of think of as uh, something that would essentially put them at a disadvantage, but as a strength, really, that they will be able to bring to whatever their team or organization or company does, in being able to try and make it more innovative and accelerate you know, the business that it does, right? So for example, in a technology company, really being able to say, well, I bring in a different perspective, and this different perspective is something that would help an organization reach out to a larger number of customers, thus helping the business, the bottom line of the company as well. And so in my mind, the day when we're able to get to that recognition, that universal recognition amongst employees, and that level of comfort that comes from the management policy and how all people at the organization and employees with disabilities start to think about and sort of gain, kind of, again, bringing it back to normalizing disability, right? Like, I think that's kind of really the ideal world, when we're not talking about specific programs, you know, to support people with disabilities, of course, accommodations aside, but really thinking about, you know, this individual characteristics and individual perspectives that add value, and disability just being one of those various individual perspectives that adds value to whatever it is that the company is trying to do in terms of innovation. So for me, the day we're able to reach that level of comfort, the day that, you know, people, employees with disabilities and others are able to see that value, which I hope is the case soon, is what would be an ideal relationship between employees with disabilities and workplaces for me.
Thank you, Kartik. What about Sharnessa and Janine? What do we think about this?
Well, I wanted to add, I'm focused on neurodiversity in the workplace, and through my website, I've set up internships and work opportunities for neurodiverse people to gain skills to then enter the workforce. And I think the door has to open. I mean, that's the ideal that I'd like to see, is for neurodiverse people, it's hard for them to get an interview because having those social skills and those presentation skills are very difficult. So if things can change, that doesn't immediately judge someone in the interview process and looks at the whole person. And I think in the ideal situation with the neurodiverse, you know, the numbers are always different, but it's about a 70 to 85% unemployment rate. And to be able to obtain jobs, to be able to be in employment that is engaging and fulfilling, and then also to keep that employment, and then to have an environment that is understanding, my colleague was talking about the differences. People are different in the workforce, and accepting those differences and having the neurotypical people in the workforce trained on working with a neurodiverse person, and understanding the different communication styles without stigma attached to that.
Thank you, Janine. And Sharnessa.
I will do my best to not try to be redundant. I think all of my colleagues have given some outstanding answers. If I were to sum this up, very short and sweet, I would say that I want to be worked out of a job. And what I mean by that is I don't want to have to make accommodations in the environment because the environment has become so inclusive and equitable and respected that humans are just different, period. And we just accept that and embrace that holistically. I think that that would be my ideal world, where we just anticipate human diversity on all levels of ability, race, gender, sexuality, all of it. We're just anticipating that, and we build our environments around the anticipated diversity that exists within all of us. I would also say that I think inclusivity, as Reem very eloquently defined, I think just using this term to make sure that our workplaces are actually embodying the term, right? And what that means is recognizing and accommodating needs, contributing, and allowing people of all different backgrounds and abilities to be able to contribute to that environment. Learning from them, leveraging their wisdom and their experience. I can't tell you how many times when COVID hit, people were stumped about what to do. And because I've worked in disabilities, this space where we are always innovating and always thinking of another way to get the same things done, that we were really valuable assets at that point, right? Because of our experiences, we're able to contribute to the thought process of thinking of another way to approach life and living now. And so I think that there's so much to gain from the disability community. And if we can get to some place where we can get to, I think Reem said it, about having a paradigm shift is what I think. And we disrupt this norm narrative that norm is able-bodied, and instead of embracing the fact that disability can account on a variety of different levels, being that it can be temporary, it can be situational, and it can also be permanent, given the circumstances and how that person is interacting with that environment. So to sum it up, I would just say, if I were to sum it up in 3 words, I would just say inclusivity, equity, and respect would be 3 words that I would love to see embodied in our institutions and in the workplace. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sharnessa. So all 4 of you have just given us a really rich sense of what an inclusive and equitable future might be. Let's discuss now the people who might be involved in making that happen. So to move closer to an equitable and inclusive future, we need to understand who bears the responsibility for making it a reality. So is it policymakers? Is it managers? Is it entrepreneurs? Is it disabled individuals? Is it non-disabled advocates? So the question for our panelists is, whose responsibility is it to bring about this ideal world, and why? Janine, if you could, please get us started.
Sure. Now, I'm sort of speaking to this question from the perspective of advocacy for the neurodiverse. So I'm addressing it from that area, and I feel like, whose responsibility is it? And it's all of ours. It's our society's responsibility. It's the obligation to give people opportunities. and to accept, as we said earlier, different types of people into the workforce. And so I think that there's laws that are part of this. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act from 2014 does support some neurodiverse going into the workforce, doesn't support it as robustly as it should, but it's a start. I mean, there definitely needs to be more. I also think, like, with my hyperlocal website, I'm just working on advocacy toward getting opportunities and creating opportunities. And I work with a nonprofit group called Tech Kids. And basically they send those young adults over to me and they work on my website. So the whole website and on the Facebook and just the newsletter and everything is structured around creating those opportunities too. And, on a grassroots level, I mean, last month, I just brought 4 parents into my living room who have neurodiverse kids. And we were brainstorming, how can we help our young adults to find a place in the workforce? And we just started networking with each other. And one had a young adult interested in the theater, and another one was a person who worked in the theater. So these are sort of all these very fundamental things that I'm trying to just kind of look for where those employment opportunities could potentially be, and bringing people together.
Thank you, Janine. Now, to our other panelists, what are your thoughts about this? Whose responsibility is it to bring about this ideal world, and why?
I would start by saying that I agree with Janine, is that this is a collective responsibility. But if I'm going to point a couple of fingers at who I think should be doing something, I would start at the government level, because the government plays such a crucial role in shaping the policies and the laws and the regulations that promote inclusion and protecting the rights of disabled individuals, right? I would also then go to the next level of employers and or business leaders. Because employers have a significant role in creating inclusive workplaces, they should actively work to eliminate any discrimination in those environments and provide some reasonable accommodations, promote diversity and equity in that space. I would also direct a finger at our educational institutions, because they shape the next level of professions or professionals that are coming up through the ranks. And so if our narrative at the educational realm is still at medical model versions of disability and only talking about disability as a deficit and how we can fix it, rather than embracing the whole disability studies, maybe the social model or social justice models of disability, I think it's a perfect environment to actually disrupt some of the norm narrative and offer the counter narratives to what society has embraced, but giving the different story, a different picture. I would then say maybe we can look at individuals with disabilities in advocacy groups to draw from wisdom from them, because they represent this group and its identity and the pride of that group, of the group holistically, and being able to draw from that would be something ideal. Got to be careful not to also tokenize individuals in that space as well, but giving room and space for them to have a voice and a seat at the table to influence the direction in which society is operating. I would also say in research, we still got to continue to research what works, what does not work. And I just think society at large, I think how we message things, whether it's through media, influencers, and other people, what we say and how we represent disability matters, and whether we're disrupting the old narratives or we are actually causing the paradigm shift that we want in how we address and talk about disability.
Thank you, Sharnissa.
Yes, in the spirit of not being redundant, I wholeheartedly agree with what everyone is saying. I just want to piggyback on a point everyone has made in terms of our educational institutions and also our K to 12 institution and the way our teachers are prepared. A lot of the research, specifically when I look personally in math and STEM, shows that, for example, students who are hard of hearing finish high school with a sixth grade level math, and so on and so forth. For those of us who are in New York State, I want to emphasize a special emphasis on government and policymaker at the state level, specifically for those of us who work in public institutions. So I'm not talking about corporation here, I'm talking about public institution. Last year, the New York State budget, which takes place between February until end of March, when legislators tend to negotiate the budget with the governor. They the governor first wanted to allocate only $2 million to enhance support for higher ed students with disability in terms of, it's called enhanced supports and services for students with disability for post-secondary success. And the $2 million, if you think about it, is nothing compared with the 86,000 identified students with disability who were attending higher ed institution in the States. There were a few lawmakers who actually wanted $15 million, and they were advocating for $15 million. And eventually, after the negotiation, they ended up with $4 million only, which amount to technically $46 per student. So it's on everyone's responsibility, but also I want to emphasize the importance for local government and local policymaker and the role they play in that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo all of that. I think the way I think about this is really thinking through, the whole life cycle of a candidate when they apply for a job and when they want to get into, a meaningful career opportunity, whatever that means for them. Starting out with formative education, again, not to repeat, but, education institutions, thinking about post-secondary education, making sure that they deliver on the responsibility of providing accommodations, timely accommodations to students with disabilities, and making sure that they have all of the resources, policymakers and governments actually implementing those policies, private players as well doing their job as well. Employers, I think, definitely from an employability perspective, have a very, very crucial role to play. Because I think it has to come from them as well in terms of they wanting to do a lot to be able to support and retain, not only provide access. And so, for example, talking from the perspective of our ability, the platform that we have to help, people with disabilities find jobs, discover jobs. One of the crucial things that we observe also is how do employers write job descriptions, for example, and if those job descriptions themselves might be ableist or might be exclusionary, right? So really thinking about all of these factors as employers, making sure that they're doing everything possible. But I do think that there's an important role to play for us within the community, and also, and I'm biased, technologists and entrepreneurs and innovators. We all have been talking about AI and generative AI and how that's going to fundamentally change the landscape of the world and open up new positions and sort of change a lot of the positions. And one of the things that we observed back in the 2000s when the web came about was the disability community or the sector wasn't as represented in a lot of the innovation at that time. And we all know what the results of those were. I mean, today, 96% of the top 1 million web pages are inaccessible, according to WebAIM, which is a digital accessibility consultancy company. We cannot afford to let that happen again, because if that happens, the companies would be adopting these products, right? And at the rate at which these products are evolving every single day, I mean, every day there are like 100 new products coming out, and enterprises are adopting these products left, right, and center. And so if we don't make noise right now, if we don't ensure that people with disabilities are a part of this innovation, and entrepreneurs and technologists and innovators are also actively involved in trying to ensure that these products are inclusive, which then of course get adopted by these companies and influence employability of people with disabilities, and also how and what these employers can do to support employees with disabilities, I think we're going to face kind of a similar thing as we did in the early 2000s, and something that we need to avoid. So I do think that there's a big role, in addition to every one that my colleagues talked about, for innovators, entrepreneurs, technologists, and others also to be thinking about what the implications of their technology and innovation are going to be for people with disabilities in all walks of their life, right from formative education to post-secondary education to employment, career discovery, etc. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Kartik. So at this point, we have discussed what an equitable and inclusive future might look like and who might help us to move in that direction. Our next question shifts us into the how of change. Advocacy is a very powerful force for change, but advocacy can have many meanings and it can take many different practical forms. So this is a three-part question. What does advocacy mean to you? How has advocacy shown up in your work? And how has your advocacy work been informed by the perspectives of disabled people and the field of disability studies? Kartik, if you could, please get us started.
Sure. And I think for me, advocacy is just educating people, and in doing so, being able to affect change, irrespective of who you are, whatever your identity is. You identify as a person with a disability, or it's around gender, sexuality, race, whatever it is, doesn't matter. But it's really you educating and advocating for, and sort of voicing your perspective and getting other people along in being able to appreciate that perspective. That's sort of what it really means for me. In practical terms, for me, advocacy is also, an employee being able to go to an employer and saying, hey, these are the accommodations that I need, or hey, I don't think that your internal software are accessible, or hey, these are the modifications that I need to make to my responsibilities because of the challenges that I'm facing, or even being able to say, hey, I don't necessarily agree with the tactics, the marketing tactics, because they're going to be exclusionary to my community, right? So it's basically anything that a person it might say or do that might influence or affect how the world works today, or how people in general view various things, or think about various aspects. That's for me is advocacy. Now, how it has shaped in my life and my work, actually, advocacy for me started at a very young age. I grew up in India, and when I was in the 10th grade, the Central Board of Education in the country at that time did not allow blind students to pursue STEM education. And so that was kind of my first challenge when, and I think certainly not something that I was prepared for, to be able to kind of challenge the government at that time. But for me, that's sort of where it started, right? To say, well, why is it that you think that people with disabilities will not be able to pursue STEM? Why do you have these policies that wouldn't provide me an equitable opportunity to be able to do whatever I want to do and to be able to study what I want to do? And that stemmed from low expectations. It's not as if they kind of were just being really annoying about it, or they deliberately did not want blind or low vision students to be able to pursue STEM. They thought that it'll be really hard. And it's going to be disastrous for the student. And so what it really took me there is a number of sort of sessions for them, meetings with them, trying to educate them on how technology empowers people with disabilities, especially those who are blind, and how I think, I as a student would be able to pursue STEM and get the permission for all the students across the country to be able to do that. So if you think about it, it was really me being able to articulate why I need it, how I'll do, and why they should support me in being able to do that. But then, in university, when I came to the US, that was very different, right? It was less so about policies, and it was less so about rules and regulations, and it was much more about, hey, this is what I need. These are the alternate formats that are going to work for me, and these are things that you might have done with other students that do not work for me, given the background that I have, and sort of given the personal circumstances that I've experienced in my life, which again is to highlight that individualistic nature that, I and a couple other colleagues were talking about, right? Just because I'm blind doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to do everything like other blind people. It's just one of the various intersectional sort of identities that I have. And so how do you think about that? And me being able to advocate for myself is again something that happened in college. And then of course, fast forward to working at a corporation. There it was different. It was sort of talking to my manager about, hey, this is sort of how I work best, and this is sort of how I think the team can support me, both in terms of specific accommodations but also cultural changes, right? In terms of how we interact, in terms of how we have our meetings, in terms of how we plan. So that again for me is advocacy, because in the process you're educating people about what I need, and in doing so, in some sense, also educating them about what workflows could look like and how they could become inclusive for people with disabilities more broadly and more generally. Again, the vision of all of this being getting to that inclusive sort of culture where this is the norm, like this just becomes something that is embedded in sort of how we work in general, right? So that sort of is how I think we can really realize, and how we can use advocacy as a way to get to the first sort of the answer to the first question we were all talking about in terms of the world that we would like to see.
Thank you, Kartik.
I will jump in here for a little bit. I think Kartik hit on a couple of important things, and I think it's advocacy is a lot about what we say and how we say it. And what I mean by that is, like, if we use language like, oh, this person is struggling, or we use language that kind of paints disability as a needy kind of lived experience, then it paints a picture for other people. So I think the language and what we say and how we present disability to others, in front of others, matters. And so I see that as a form of advocacy, like how we speak about it shapes the culture and the climate around us. And then the second part that I would say is it about what we do. And what I mean by that is one of the key things and how it has shown up for me, advocacy has shown up for me, is number one, educating myself and not thinking that I know it all, or that I'm, embracing a very paternalistic approach of I've got to protect everybody with a disability, or I have to fix everybody with a disability. And I think when I first started in my professional career in speech pathology, I thought I was coming in to fix people, and it was very medical model. And that was what I was being nurtured in from an academic realm. And so it wasn't until I got into my master's program, where it was disability studies, and someone gave me a counter narrative. Somebody said something different. Someone gave me the social model to grapple with. And I think that it's what you do. It's how you educate yourself, and what you expose yourself to determines what our actions are. And so some of the things that I did as an assistive technology specialist was I would advocate with the vendors that their products be accessible. And I would suggest changes and modifications based on the feedback of the individuals that I was working with, and things that they would say, oh, I wish it did this, or I wish it did that. I would go back to those manufacturers and those vendors and the people who were creating these technologies and say, this is what you need to do, because this would meet this need for another person, or this would expand the ability of this. And so I think it's how we advocate can be sometimes in, just making suggestions to people and educating them on what needs are, so that they can actually do something about it. And so I think when we suggest changes and actually put in the work to see them implemented is advocacy.
Thank you, Sharnessa.
Yeah, I agree with everyone. Particularly for me, advocacy is learning. It is educating as Kartik said and as Sharnisa said, but I think it's really learning. That's why I'm in this program actually. And I think to a certain level, learning is really what allows one to start pushing for some of those small changes that eventually may become at some point systemic. Because let's not deny it, we live in an ableist society. So unless we learn and we well round ourselves with what we need to know, specifically someone like me who's completely able-bodied, it's hard to become an advocate and an ally. And in my own work, it has manifested itself by talking with folks who work with individuals with disability, our director of accessibility office, folks who have actually been working with students with disabilities to understand how does the system work, what are the intricacy of the system that I cannot see from my position of privilege and from my interactions, because folks have different positions and sometimes we don't get to interact with folks who truly understand the needs of those with disabilities. And the other thing that showed up really in my work is collaborations with folks who have similar interests, with whom, we could have those discussions so we could stay aware, even if we're not actively sometimes taking action, but stay aware of how systemic ableism is manifesting itself in the actual workplace. In my early reading, when I joined this program, there's a metaphor that really hit me that from Jay Dolmage, who has written a book on academic ableism. And it's that metaphor of the steep steps. And it resonated with me. And I think other institutions or organizations may see similarity. How he highlighted that the physical and metaphorical barriers that disabled students and staff and faculty face in university really, in a way, reflect the societal and institutional structures that perpetuate those barriers. And so our question is, do we want to be complacent in such a system, or do we want to understand that system so you could disrupt it? And those comparisons that actually Dolmage make about the accessibility challenges on campus really underscores that disability is actually always present, but the university system, which you could also talk about other organizations, it often sorts and excludes them based on a very narrow definition of ability. And as other panelists have pointed, there's an intersectional nature here. We have students and staff with intersectional identity. And what Dolmage basically observed of what he calls the effort outcome gap faced by minority students, for example, it underscores why we need to be better advocate and why at least we need to be attuned to that intersectional identities. And that's all I wanted to say.
Well, I can jump in here and again, kind of address it from where my interest is in neurodiversity and the workforce. And I really think the advocacy goes to, there's so many companies that have their mandates are inclusion and equity, but inclusion and equity doesn't always cover everybody. And from the neurodiversity perspective, I feel as though that is not covered. So I think that there really needs to be advocacy for the neurodiverse to be included into the workforce. And as I said earlier, there's already a barrier up with the interview process, for people who struggle with communication and effective communication, that's already a barrier to enter into the workforce. And then a lot of the recommendations, at least from advisors and career counselors, are to not disclose the neurodiversity when entering the workforce. Get the job first and then talk about the accommodations. So the person is entering into the situation and then hoping that they can get the accommodations once they're in there. And I think that that really has to change, because the neurotypical environment just needs to have more understanding and compassion toward the communication style, toward the work style, toward the approach of the neurodiverse person in the workforce. You know, for example, hybrid kind of work situations, working home 2 or 3 days a week, or working in a quiet office space, or working in a space that's dimly lit, like just all the different opportunities for accommodation. There has to be a lot of advocacy about that. And there's a lot of stigma and discrimination that is attached to neurodiverse people. And that goes back to the question of disclosure. I just don't think the recommendations are don't say anything. And that's really kind of sad that that is happening, but get that foot in the door and then say it. And then the other way of disclosure is don't say I'm autistic or I'm neurodiverse. It's saying these are the accommodations that I need. You know, I need a hybrid work week, or I need a quiet space, or I need to be communicated in writing and not verbally. So I think there's a lot to navigate in entering the workforce. There's a lot surrounding the politics, and I just wish it wasn't so complicated and so hard to do.
Thank you, Janine. So finally, before we move into the Q&A, it would be helpful if our panelists would share just a few words of practical advice. So the question is, what is just one piece of practical, hard-won advice that you would give to people who may be new to this work, but who have heard everything that you've said tonight and they want to go and advocate for change in their workplaces? If you could just give us one quick piece of practical advice. Sharnessa, if you could, please get us started.
I would say educate yourself. Educate yourself on the experiences of individuals with disabilities, understand the laws, understand who your allies are, understand your institutional data, understand the policies and things that really impact the work and the way that you want to move forward, and understand, educate yourself on how to fully engage with the leadership, because a lot of times what we hit is barriers to leaders understanding things. And so understanding the culture and climate of your institution and how to navigate that to do the work that needs to be done. So I would just say, with educating yourself and then modeling through example how you want to be able to be effectively create and foster an inclusive environment for people with disabilities.
Reem, Janine, or Kartik, one piece of practical advice.
I could jump in here. My one piece of practical advice is it takes 3 to 5 years to enter the workforce. Just with training and preparation and finding an environment that is accepting of someone who thinks differently, communicates differently, approaches problems differently. It takes time.
My advice is going to be open to be challenged every day. I've been doing this, as I'm sure many of my colleagues have been doing this for years, and I can tell you every single day, even as a person with a disability, as a disability advocate, an activist, as someone who develops technology, I realize how wrong I am every single day, or maybe I didn't think about a different perspective. This is a very complex interplay of various intersectionalities coming together in shaping who one is as a person. It's as I mentioned before, just because I'm blind does not necessarily mean I'm going to do the same thing as someone else. There's not a right answer. And so if we really want to do this well and do this correctly, we have to be ready to learn and unlearn every single day.
Yeah, my piece of advice is alongside with what everyone said, start small but think big. And by thinking big, I'm thinking about one, your alliances, but also what's in it for your organizations. We know that sometimes we get discouraged because when you try to think big, you're thinking about systemic changes. But look at the institutional research about your organization. What does the data for your organization say? And what is the mission? And where is the misalignment between the two, if any? And where this could misalignment be coming from? We all have seen in May 2020 how a lot of companies were rushing on all social media platforms to write down lofty statements about how they're going to fight racism and be an active ally. And what you could do, look at not just your organizational data, but what's going on. One of the things I have learned by doing some research is actually Goldman Sachs has a neurodiversity hiring initiative. This is something that wouldn't come to my mind. I've heard it before and I did some research. And if organization, I'm not sure, I'm not speaking that it's about the program itself, but I know that it exists. So, and I'm guessing the reason why it exists, it has a business case for it. The same way nonprofit organizations such as higher education, they may have mission and strategic goals and maybe excluding or not looking into the outcomes of folks with disability is really not helping them achieve those strategic goals. That's what I mean by think big, but start small.
Thank you, Reem, and thank you again to all four of our panelists. I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Markham, to lead our Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. I really feel like this has been a tremendous discussion. I feel that it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to listen to our panelists and their insights this evening about the ways in which disability is a strength, diversity and difference are assets. Disability is not a problem to be corrected. It's an opportunity to be explored, a way to think differently, a way to do things differently. And I just really appreciate those insights and thank everyone again for being here. We do have a couple of questions. The first is from Kamisha, who says, as an HR practitioner, I would love to be aware of appropriate or inappropriate terms to use in the workplace and as a whole. Is there any advice from the panelist on language?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in there and not to market, but I will take the opportunity. Something, and this is sort of what I was talking about when it comes to generative AI and technology and all of the work that we're seeing with large language models. One of the things that we at Our Ability have been focused on is ableism. And how do we make sure that job descriptions are inclusive, not just inclusive in terms of the terms that you use, but also inclusive in terms of the job requirements that you put out there, right? Like really questioning yourself whether each of those requirements is something that you actually need. Right? If the job does not involve driving and companies put a driver's license as a requirement, then it doesn't help anyone, but it excludes a lot of high potential people with disabilities who might now not apply to this job because they don't have a driver's license. So I think it really comes down to reflecting and thinking deeply and and making this a practice in terms of when you're writing these job descriptions, when you're putting out these documents, thinking about the terminology, but also thinking about the content and saying, am I inadvertently missing out someone that I shouldn't? Right. So that's, again, something that, I've learned kind of doing this, but also, again, as I said, technology has a big role to play here as well. And super excited about what, especially with generative AI, we're able to accomplish in terms of detecting and helping out with ableist language and this kind of information.
Okay, and we have another question from Leah who asked, are there any recommendations for books that we could read if we're new to this topic, we want to learn more? I know that Reem recommends Academic Ableism by Jay Dalmage. I think that's a book of particular interest to people working in the university setting. Our other panelists, or Reen, do you have other suggestions, or other panelists maybe have other reading suggestions?
We put some in the chat, Sharnisa and I, if you'd like to read them. I don't know if others could see them.
Great, okay. I guess you could look for those in the chat.
Sure. I could say mine, and then Sharnisa could say hers.
Sure.
I'm studying in this field, so I'm reading a lot of the academic papers, and so, but if you're not in this particular field, I found it helpful to start reading memoirs, such as Being a Human and Visibility Disability by Alice Wong. It gives you those first stories that then you could move into other reading. That's my perspective, and I'm sure others have other recommendations.
Yes, so I'm also studying in this area, working on my dissertation. So I have plenty of them like right here at my, at my desk. I dropped a couple in there. Discrit, I thought that was a really good one by Connor Ferry and Enema. That I think that both of those were really great. I would also, if depending on your setting, so there's Disability as Diversity in Higher Education by Kim and Aquino. I think that one's a good one. Unlearning Disability by Anne Marie Baines is another one. Yeah, there's just a lot to unpack in this space. I would just say Google a few things, or Amazon is where I got most of my books from, will be a good place to get started. It just depends on your context and your environment of what you want to kind of hone in on.
I just dropped Eli Clare in. He's very good.
I agree with all of those book recommendations, and someone Edie, I believe, I think I'm saying your name right, Edie. You're recommending Joe Shapiro's Classic History, No Pity, which is a good book, especially if you're new to the topic of disability history. And I love Alice Wong's work and Eli Clare's work, and there's just a lot of good stuff out there. We have one more question. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to get to the last question from Lenine. How do you approach employers to disclose your accommodation needs with the purpose of determining if that work environment is the place for you without scaring off your potential employer? Because I think some of us can agree that the stigma of disclosure before you get to the job has a lot to do with the potential for discrimination that can happen once you leave the room. So I guess this is really, how do you approach disclosure in a way that doesn't leave you vulnerable to discrimination?
I think the way I think about this is really using metaphors as much as possible to simplify your needs, and kind of using something that they can relate to, but also I don't remember the exact statistic at the moment, but there was this research that came out a couple of months ago, which was talking about how the majority of accommodations actually do not have any associated cost. Right, it's just, you know, the employer being more accepting and making certain adjustments to responsibilities, or sort of the work or the work environment, etc. And so kind of thinking about that and making sure that you articulate that, but also using metaphors to really simplify what you need and why you need it. And you know, this goes back to the advocacy question, right? Making it very simple for them to follow along and understand is something that has worked really well for me personally.
And I would also add to that is just the example of using a metaphor. I think people can sometimes relate to that, using those metaphors and making it a common sort of analogy for them to understand. Like, you know, I need paper and pen, like you need paper and pencil. I rely on computer access, or, you know, I may need different lighting sometimes, but those aren't unusual things. It's just a different way of going about the same outcome. And I think just and really pointing out the person's individual strengths and what you're going to add to the environment, and how this is a minor thing compared to what the value the person's skill set will bring to the role and the position is important to make salient in that moment, I think, with the employer.
Great. So we are 1 minute past the hour. We do have one question that popped up. If folks want to stick around and answer it, it's from my friend and colleague, Angela Francis. But I just want to say, for the sake of respecting everyone's time, thank you again for joining us. I want to give a special shout out to Tamara Colon, our assistant AD here at Disability Studies, who helped us organize this event. And thank again Heather Zeman and Molly Joyce in events. Thank you to Dr. Brian Allais for his conceptualizing this event and really working with us to help put it together. And it's really great to see students and faculty joining us this evening. It's a great pleasure and privilege, as I said, to host this event and to talk with you about ways that we can build a more inclusive and equitable world together. So on that concluding note, Angela Francis asks, thank you for this thought-provoking conversation. If there's time, I wonder if any of the panelists has any other thoughts on how we can best advocate for intersectionality in mind, with intersectionality in mind. Does anyone want to share their thoughts on how to advocate from an intersectional perspective?
I can take a shot. Oh, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think the key is you as an advocate really being very open, right? And getting along with you, people from diverse intersectional identities in that advocacy movement, or what we're trying to do, right? Because that then ensures that the narrative is not just, hey, this is what I need, or hey, this is what you should do, hey, this is work, but it's like, here are some sort of guiding principles, but it translates to different things for different people. Here's it's kind of like what we're doing today, right? We're talking about all of us work in the disability space, but we've all had different experiences, and so to kind of really being able to bring along like diverse people and sort of have them share their perspectives, and then that informing what others can do is something that I think should really be at the center of advocacy.
Carnessa?
I was just going to say, I think just when we think of just intersectionality and just how that plays out, is that every person has intersecting identities. There's no way to divide those elements up. And so I think that it would be a missed opportunity for us not to leverage the identities of the individuals in the space. And so I think talking about it from that perspective is that everybody has a race, a gender, sexuality, identity, or some of those things, but kind of disrupting all of that and just not being in a box, I guess, and not putting things in a binary, either you are or aren't. I think just talking about it from those terms and just normalizing the fact that we're all different backgrounds and no one person is what we call normal across all levels. Like everybody's on different levels of being and existing and ability. And so I think using those terminologies to actually frame our intersecting identities. And I think that, in a context where a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals are being challenged politically, I think that disability is that one grounding element that these other identities can actually latch on to, because it's intersecting with all of their identities. And so if you're at an institution that doesn't support diversity, equity, and inclusion rhetoric and things of that sort, if there's a disability group, there's a space for disability to actually be that element that talks about the intersecting identities of the individuals within those institutions. So that's just my ideals about it, but I do think that there's a great and wonderful opportunity to leverage whatever part of the identity that exists within the person, to open the door for other identities to have space and community.
I think that's a great way to close us out. And I think that disability really dramatizes intersectionality, because we can have the same disability, but we experience it differently because of our background, because of our beliefs, because of our different bodies. And disability and the disability perspectives invite us to embrace diversity rather than try to eliminate it or fix it. So thank you again to Reem, to Kartik, to Sharnessa, and to Janine. Just fantastic perspectives from all of you tonight, and thanks for everyone who was able to join us and able to help us put off this wonderful event in recognition of National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So I hope that we've been able to give you some tools and some food for thought that you can take out into the world when you're thinking about disability and inclusion in the workplace for the rest of the year. Thank you, everybody, and keep a lookout for future events from the Department of Disability Studies in the future. Take care and have a great night.
Good night.